Alright, we are going to start chapter 30 in the Raven text, which is on the green plants, sort of working our way up from the ancestors to the land plants, which are types of green algae that we will talk about a little bit, although not too extensively. That's not really so much what this class is. But then start moving into the bryophytes and eventually into the tracheophyte plants. So, going back about 1 billion years, we started seeing some signs of evidence of ancestry between older green algae type organisms and modern day-ish land plants. And so there's a push now, and in fact, in many cases, this has been done, at least in a lot of people's minds, to include a lot, if not all, of the green algae into a group with the plants and create a new kingdom. All right, so this is huge. This is a big deal. Creating a new kingdom of organisms is a huge deal. This is not like creating a new family or a new genus. This is like, this is the highest level almost of classification of organisms. So what it would be then would be a group of protists, bacteria, archaeobacteria. The fungi would more or less stay the same. There would be the Viridiplantae, which includes the green algae as well as the sort of more traditional land plants. And then, of course, you'd also have the animal kingdom. There are some other photoautotrophic kinds of organisms that can use sunlight to manufacture their own carbohydrates. For example, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria would be a great example of a photoautotrophic organism that is not a plant. But in many cases, plants have kind of the, not really monopoly, but pretty close to it on being a photoautotroph. And so it's thought actually that because of the relationship among modern day green algae and land plants, there probably was a single species that gave rise to the modern day terrestrial plant lineages. Looking in the green algae, there are two main groups. There are the chlorophytes, there's the chlorophyta, and then there's the charophyta or charophyta, depending on who you talk to. I usually go with charophyta. The chlorophyta never made it onto land. They are not the ancestors to the modern day terrestrial land plants. They are perhaps a close cousin, but they are not the descendants of our modern day land plants. The charophytes are a sister group, and very likely the land plant lineage came from a species of charophyte type plants. Now, land plants have what is called a haplodiplontic life cycle. Another way of saying haplodiplontic is you could also say they have what's called alteration of generations. And so what this means is that plants in their life cycle have both a multicellular haploid and a multicellular diploid stage. Now this doesn't really sound like it's maybe that important. It sounds like maybe something, okay, I don't really quite understand that, so I'm just going to put my head in the sand and just pretend it doesn't exist. But the haplodiplontic life cycle of plants is one of their biggest and most important features, and we're going to see it a lot. By the time we're done with this next series of upcoming chapters, you're going to be absolutely sick of hearing about alteration of generations, but it's a very important part of what land plants do. Part of this has to do with the fact that moving onto land, the diploid part of the life cycle especially gives the embryo more protection if it's surrounded by diploid tissue, and we'll kind of talk more about that here in a few minutes. Multicellular haploid and multicellular diploid. If you contrast that, for example, to what animals do, which is probably what you're more familiar with based on your previous experience, or of course certainly based in this class, animals have a primarily diploid life cycle. The haploid part of our life cycle is small. It is temporary. It's single-celled. It's not around all that long. The diploid part of our life cycle is by far the more dominant part. If you look at plants, they have both. They have a multicellular diploid and a multicellular haploid part to their life cycle. It would kind of be the equivalent of if mammals had a multicellular diploid U and also a multicellular haploid U, which was like some sort of multicellular sperm or egg creature that sort of resembles what you look like. That would be kind of the equivalent of what plants do, at least in terms of genetically what it is. The haploid stage, as we start getting into the more advanced land plants, begins to become a less emphasized part of the life cycle, and the diploid part becomes more emphasized, but they still definitely do maintain multicellular haploid and diploid. All right, so here's what we're looking at with plant family tree, as this slide is titled. We have an outgroup over here called the red algae. Outgroups are kind of the closest member of a clade, so this entire rest of this group is a clade. And then you typically would include the closest relative or like cousin over here on the side, which would be the red algae. We then have the next most dissimilar group, which would be the chlorophytes, the green algae. So we'll take a look at what some of those are. Volvox and a few of the ones that maybe you saw in Principles 1 are chlorophytes. And then we have the charophytes, which is the sister group. This one's a little bit less similar to the plants, but certainly more similar to the plants than the chlorophytes are. And then we start looking at the terrestrial plants, our bryophytes, which are liverworts, mosses, hornworts, tracheophytes, which are all of these, the club mosses, the ferns and horsetails, and the gymnosperms and the angiosperms are all land plants. So moving on to land. Just like when animals did this, there is a certain set of challenges that come along with living your life primarily in a terrestrial environment. Number one, you have to prevent yourself from drying out. And so covering the plant with a layer of cuticle or a layer of wax to help seal in water was kind of a big step forward. As we start moving even further away from water, so there's kind of a parallel here between what happened with animals and what happened with plants. With animals, we had the fishes, which then gave rise to amphibians, who kind of sort of moved away from the water, but still had to be near it for when reproduction was supposed to happen. And then to the reptiles, which were more independent of water, and eventually birds and mammals, right? They're more or less independent from being in water as well. The same thing happens with plants. Jump back a second here. The bryophytes, liverworts and mosses and hornworts. These three groups absolutely have to be near water, at least for the part of their life cycle for when reproduction happens. The bryophytes, aka the seedless non-vascular plants, are kind of the amphibian equivalent in the plant world because they're living near water, but still kind of the first ones to move out of water at least a little bit. So they're kind of like amphibians in that way, I suppose. Once we start getting beyond the bryophytes, we start seeing tracheids. And if you remember back to the last chapter, 36, we talked about tracheids, which are a type of xylem cell. All of the tracheophyte plants, so the club mosses, the ferns and horsetails, gymnosperms and angiosperms, all four of these groups have tracheids. The angiosperms and one of the gymnosperms also happens to have vessels as well for moving water, but all of these have tracheids. And having the ability to move water with tracheids allows plants to get a lot bigger. Why is it that you never see mosses that get very big? Why don't you ever see any 100-foot tall mosses? Well, they don't have vascular tissue. They don't have xylem to move water 100 feet away from the ground up into the canopy of a tree, so it's really hard for them to get to a bigger size. Once you start providing plants with vascular tissue like tracheids and eventually vessels, plants begin to get a lot bigger. Once you move on to land, you also lose the protection of the water as it pertains to UV protection. Okay, so we have sunlight, we have ultraviolet radiation, which can lead to mutations. So what we're going to do in the plant world now is we're going to shift away from a haploid-dominated life cycle to a diploid-dominated life cycle. If we jump back here again to this picture, the bryophyte plants tend to emphasize the haploid part of their life cycle. They might be, just to more or less make up some numbers here, 80% gametophyte, haploid stage, and 20% sporophyte, which is the diploid stage. They're 80% haploid and 20% diploid as far as how long they spend in any given part of their life cycle. If we shift to the lycophytes and the ferns and the horsetails, these two groups are going to spend maybe 50-50. 50% of the life is in the haploid stage, 50% of the life is in the diploid stage. As we move into the gymnosperms and angiosperms, which again, these two are the most independent of water of all the plants, these two are going to be like 80 to 90% diploid and maybe 10 to 20% haploid. So we see a shift. All of these groups of plants have both multicellular haploid and multicellular diploid stages. They do have the haplodiplontic alteration of generations life cycle, but the amount of time they spend is different in the haploid versus the diploid stage as we go up through the different groups of plants. The ones that are more independent of water are going to have a more dominant diploid stage because that's going to give them protection against UV light and therefore prevent mutations. And so we move more into the alteration of generations, haplodiplontic life cycle, which is one of the key features of the plants. This alteration of generations, and when we get to double fertilization and angiosperms, those two topics are the ones that are the bane of many of 1520 students' existence because they are really kind of difficult to wrap your mind around them because animals don't do anything really quite like this. So you got to take a step back and look at what they're doing to really understand what it is. Humans, again, have more of a diploid-dominated life cycle. If you were to look at fungi and a lot of the protists, they're going to spend the vast majority of their lives in the haploid stage, but plants do both. So we need to take a look at this life cycle some more. We're going to kind of keep referring back to this alteration of generations, or haplodiplontic life cycle throughout the next few chapters. The stage of the plant, or the structure in the plant, that is multicellular and diploid is also referred to as the sporophyte. Sporophyte literally means spore plant. And so in the sporophyte part of the life cycle, these plants are going to be going through meiosis, and as we know, meiosis is going to help them cut the number of chromosomes in half. They're going to be producing cells that are haploid out of cells that were initially diploid. Once these so-called spores get out in the environment and germinate, they're eventually going to give rise to the haploid part of the life cycle. So, in especially the larger gymnosperms and angiosperms, there are going to be what are called spore mother cells. Either megaspore mother cells, which eventually give rise to the female gametes, or microspore mother cells, which eventually give rise to the male gametes. They are produced in what are called sporangia. The sporangium is the spore-producing part of the plant. Spore mother cells eventually give rise to the so-called spores. Okay, so each one of those diploid spore mother cells, whether it's megaspore or microspore, is going to eventually give rise to 4 haploid spores. These are then going to begin the next gametophyte generation. So we take this haploid spore, we either keep it inside the plant itself if it's a gymnosperm or angiosperm, or disperse it out into the environment if it's like a fern or a horsetail or a club moss, or if it's a bryophyte. They're going to go out and they're going to more or less germinate, they're going to start to grow, and they're going to give rise to the multicellular haploid part of the life cycle. So that then is called the gametophyte. The sporophyte makes spores, the gametophyte makes, wait for it, gametes. Okay, so this plant's what's actually going to be generating eventually sperm cells and egg cells. Megaspore mother cells give rise to eventually a female gamete-producing plant. Microspore mother cells eventually give rise to a microspore, or male gamete-generating plant. The microspores give rise to male gametophytes, which then produce male gametes. So within the multicellular gametophyte, we're going to have mitosis. And so this is a way for these haploid cells to basically amplify their numbers. Right? The spores are amplified by mitosis. They are going to also start producing gametes through mitosis, which again, this is huge. This is way different from what animal cells do. Animals, we never make our gametes through mitosis, right? We always make our gametes through meiosis, but plants actually make theirs through mitosis. Well, how is that possible? Let's go back here and look at this plant. Genetically, this gametophyte plant is already haploid. So the gametes, which also need to be haploid, can just be produced through mitosis, right? They can just continue to crank out cells that are haploid without going through meiosis, because this individual is already haploid. So this allows them to make a huge number of gametes, which can fuse together. You can have male gametes and female gametes, or something kind of the rough equivalent of that, to make a zygote, again, single-celled zygote, which then becomes the first cell of the next sporophyte generation. Okay, so I know this is not really probably all that clear quite yet. It's actually not as bad as what it might seem like at first, but we know what haploid is, we know what diploid is, we know what meiosis and mitosis are. We just kind of have to piece those terms together and make them fit what's going on here with this plant life cycle. All right, so this picture here I like. It shows it kind of nicely. We'll go ahead and start down here with the sporophyte, because this is the part of most plant life cycles that we are generally most familiar with. Sporophyte is going to have, to some degree, somewhere on it, what are called sporangia. These sporangia produce spore mother cells, again, either microspore mother cells or megaspore mother cells. And depending on which of those two we produce, either female or male for mega versus microspore mother cells respectively, we're going to start producing spores through meiosis. We're going to take these diploid cells, run them through meiosis, and make a bunch of haploid spores. These can then start to grow. This is a single cell, it's haploid, but if it starts to go through mitosis, it can become a multicellular gametophyte. This gametophyte can then start producing gametes through mitosis to make a bunch of egg cells or sperm cells, depending on if it's a male or female gametophyte. These two can then fuse together. A sperm cell from one plant and an egg cell from another plant can fuse together. Fertilization happens. We get a single-celled zygote, which then undergoes mitosis to become an embryo, which eventually leads us back to the sporophyte part of the life cycle. It's not that bad, right? But the key thing here with the plants is that depending on which groups of plants we're looking at, the gametophyte or sporophyte might be more dominant than the other. In the mosses, for example, the gametophyte is the dominant generation. In the angiosperms, the sporophyte is by far the dominant generation, and you really hardly never see the gametophyte unless you're really expressly looking for it, like we're going to be in a few days. Okay, so let's go back to our taxonomy here of our plants. We had our green algae. We talked about the chlorophytes. Chlorophytes, the Chlorophyta, this is a phylum, and the Chlorophyta is the one that eventually gave rise to all of the green algae that are not the plant ancestors. They never made it onto land. The Streptophyta is the one that gave rise to the land plants. Streptophyta includes the charophytes and also the ancestors to plants. Right? So chlorophytes, even though in the water, a lot of the green algae really kind of look superficially like a plant, they are different enough in many ways, both morphologically, anatomically, physiologically, and most importantly, genetically. They're different enough that we know that they're not ancestors or ancestral to land plants. The chloroplasts are different, for example. There's just enough differences for us to reasonably assume that the chlorophytes are a parallel cousin sort of a lineage to what eventually became the land plants. Chlorophyta, again, just to kind of talk about those a little bit, we've seen in Principles 1, we look at Chlamydomonas. The species is not this one. It's a similar looking species. They're very, very tiny. If you guys remember Chlamydomonas from 1510, they are excruciatingly small. You had to be at 400 times magnification to get any picture of what they were at all, and even then they were really hard to draw. They're very, very tiny, and certainly they're single-celled. The Chlorophyta, like Chlamydomonas, for example, often has a couple of flagella. It's single-celled, like I mentioned before. Mostly haploid life cycle, right? So down here we see the life cycle of Chlamydomonas. They can reproduce asexually, as these darker green ones are doing here. The lighter green ones are also producing asexually to produce these. They have what are called different mating strains. They're not male or female exactly. And again, they're single-celled, so we know that they're not really making a lot of sperm cells or egg cells. But they're what we call different mating strains. And if they're compatible, these two can get together and they can actually fuse and make some type of diploid stage, in this case called a zygospore, which is diploid, which eventually very quickly then gives rise back to haploid individual cells. So it's different than what plants do. They do asexual, they do sexual, but they are certainly not male or female. They're certainly not multicellular. They're in some ways kind of similar to what plants do, but many other ways very, very different than what plants do. They're not haplodiploidic, right? So if we look at the definition of what haplodiploidic is, right, it's got to be both multicellular haploid and multicellular diploid. These are not that. They're single-celled. So we know they're not haplodiploidic. Volvox is another one. This is one of the all the crowd favorites in 1510. Everybody likes Volvox. Being sarcastic here. But Volvox is another one. This is actually a colonial one. So whereas Chlamydomonas was single-celled, Volvox is actually a colonial, maybe arguably multicellular green algae, but probably not. But certainly lots and lots of cells here, anywhere between 500 and 60,000 cells per colony. There is a degree of specialization. So these cells within the colony, each one of these little green dots here, these little guys, little tiny green dots, those are cells. And these cells have flagella. The reason why before I kind of hedged about why these might actually be multicellular, remember, to be multicellular, you have to have some type of specialization. There appears to be some of that with Volvox. For example, if you look at a Volvox colony and watch it for long enough, what you'll see is there's a tendency for one part of it to kind of serve as what is essentially the front of the colony. It's the part that's typically, first as it's moving through the water. Let's pretend it's down here. We'll pretend this is kind of the front end of this colony. These little green dots over here, these little cells over here are going to have shorter flagella than the ones in the back of the colony. The ones in the back are going to be responsible more for propulsion than the ones in the front. So that sounds kind of like specialization, and added to that is that we do have, within this larger colony, each one of these is a daughter colony. These little guys here are little tiny miniature versions of the mother colony, which can eventually break off and become their own little Volvox colony. So it turns out these little cells inside of here, some of them apparently seem to be somewhat specialized to take on that role. They are the ones that are going to become reproductive. So these reproductive cells here were generated by other cells in the colony. So again, these can be sexual, they can also be asexual, still not really too plant-like, but getting somewhat closer to what we're going to see in the Charophyta and some of the ones that look more like land plants. Ulva, which is also sometimes called sea lettuce, this should not be one word, this is two words. Ulva is a multicellular chlorophyte. There are two distinct words there. There should be a space that I missed here. Multicellular chlorophyte is also called sea lettuce. This one actually does have a haplodiplontic life cycle. If we look over here, okay, we've got two different mating strains. One of them is a plus strain, one of them is a minus strain. They're not exactly male or female. That doesn't really apply to ulva so much, but they are compatible mating strains. And so their gametangia can produce gametes, which are compatible. Again, these are not sperm cells or egg cells. They don't really look like either one so much. They look like a combination of both, actually. But they're compatible, so they can get together. They create a zygote, which then undergoes mitosis to become an embryo, which eventually gives rise to a diploid sporophyte, which has sporangia, just like a land plant has, which can go through meiosis to produce spores. That's what you guys hear are spores, which can then disperse out away from the sporophyte plant and produce a gametophyte plant. So this now looks really, at least as far as the life cycle genetically, a lot like a plant, doesn't it? It's got both parts of the life cycle. It's doing both. It's got multicellular haploid and multicellular diploid. One big difference is, this bullet point over here might suggest, they look the same. The haploid part and the diploid part look very, very similar. That's not the case in plants. When you see plants, when we start looking at sporophytes and gametophytes, they are extremely different. In ulva, which is kind of one of the closer examples in the chlorophyte world to what a plant might look like, these two are more or less identical. You actually have to look at them genetically to see which one is haploid and which one is diploid. Right? So again, these chlorophytes, the chlorophyta, didn't give rise to the land plants, but in many ways, especially for some of these more advanced groups, they really start to look like plants. Let's take a look at the charophytes now. Again, one of the groups of streptophytes are the charophytes. This is also a different group, a different clade of green algae, but they are green algae. And these are again the ones, this is the sister group, this is the one that most likely gave rise to the land plants. They are a sister group because their chloroplasts are, for one reason, biochemically similar to what the plants are doing. Certainly more similar than what the chlorophytes are doing. So certainly more closely related than that top clade up here with the chlorophytes. So, charophytes are going to have haplodiplontic life cycles. They're going to have this should be haplodiplontic up here, so don't let that confuse you. This is kind of the same thing as haplodiplontic. This is going to allow us to move on to land. Again, we're going to have protection of the embryo from UV light, which is kind of key if you're moving onto land where there is more UV light. And so within the Charophyta, we're going to look at a couple of clades. There are the Chirales and there are the Coleocytales, which are two possible groups which could have given rise to the land plants. These two are two separate groups within the Charophyta that different people have argued at different times may have been the ones that gave rise to the plants. And does this really matter which one it was? Probably not to any great practical degree, but it is kind of cool to kind of think about who came from whom and who the descendant of this was, or who gave rise to that plant, and kind of piece together an overall picture of what life on Earth has looked like for the past couple of billion years. Both of these two groups, the Chirales and the Coleocytales, are very commonly found around both freshwater ponds and also marshes. In freshwater ponds and marshes both, a marsh is a wetland. Typically it doesn't have much in the way of trees. It's mostly herbaceous, grassy vegetation and other kinds of algae and things. They tend to dry up periodically. And so for plants that live around the edge of ponds and marshes, it is kind of beneficial to be able to survive for a while out of the water, because green algae, as we know, tend to be aquatic. And if the water were to dry up, that could become problematic for those plants. So these two groups begin to develop abilities to maintain themselves even when conditions are relatively dry. So you can imagine that if a plant was able to do that for longer and longer and longer amounts of time, eventually, even if that body of water dried up completely and was completely gone, these little green algae, maybe started to call them land plants here, are going to start to be primarily terrestrial. They're not aquatic anymore. They're not semi-aquatic anymore. They are completely terrestrial because the water is gone. And once that happens, we now have what effectively, by definition then, is a terrestrial type of organism. In this case, it would be a plant. It's got the right life cycle. It's haplodiplontic. It's got other biochemical similarities to what we know about plants today, but now it's living strictly on land without having to be near water, or at least in the water. Okay, so it becomes what effectively then is a land plant. All right, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to start a new section here in just a second. As soon as I finish apparently going through puberty when my voice stops changing and cracking. And we'll pick up again here in just a second.